Well, when I was a kid growing up here in North Texas, I lived in Grand Prairie, and my family had a house that sat on about 2 acres of land with a creek running behind it. I spent many days in this idyllic situation for a young kid at 8 or 9 years old, traipsing through the tall grass back to the woods and the creek. When the grass got high, I would take a riding lawnmower and mow the acreage behind our house, often finding a snake would shoot out of the mower that I hadn't seen, but had been waiting in the tall grass. I would go through the woods with my friends and encounter things like snapping turtles with their jaws open, often keeping a watchful eye for a water moccasin in the creek or other snakes. And one day, one of those water moccasins made its way up from the creek and to our house. And I knew so because I heard my mother scream. I was in the house. She had opened the garage door to find a huge water moccasin coiled up at the foot of the door, scared and angry. And my mom, being my mom, took care of the problem. She grabbed a pump pellet gun and killed the snake quickly. That image of seeing the garage door open with my mother with a pellet gun looking at this venomous snake protecting her family, her child in that moment, is one that I remember. She did take the snake's life, and I'm glad. There was a kind of holy fear at work that knew what was dangerous and what was not. We're not exactly born afraid of things like spiders and snakes. We're born with the predisposition to be afraid, but the content of our fears, at least what we're learning from neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists, is taught to us. We're born with the capacity to fear, but the content of what we fear is taught. And a lot of recent studies seem to suggest that some things are more easily taught to fear than others. It's easier for us to switch the spider switch and the snake switch than it is to teach a child to be afraid of flowers, for example. We're born able to fear, thank God, because some things are dangerous. But we are also taught what and whom to fear. When we have a healthy fear of a snake or a spider, it can be a good thing that keeps us safe, but often we are taught to fear other people. Often people like me grew up learning subtle and not so subtle messages that black and brown bodies were scarier than white ones. Think of all the lessons I learned about where to be afraid, and maybe you did too. The nightly news that decides to show some people over others as a threat. Politicians who use not so coded language to talk about the people who are out to get us or coming across the border or wanting to take jobs or criminals. The movies showed heroes who looked like me, often fighting people who did not. Think of the subtle lessons that we teach. An arm around a child's shoulder, holding them a little tighter when a particular kind of person walks down the street. Or the car door being locked when a certain type of individual is closer, or the phrase that we all know so well, a bad neighborhood. When I was growing up, when my culture said a bad neighborhood, I knew what they meant. They didn't mean a neighborhood full of people who looked like me. Subtle and not so subtle messages are taught all the time, and they have deadly consequences. In the last few weeks, we've been reminded once again of something that has been true for a long time. White fear against black and brown bodies can be weaponized. A white person calling the police on a phone and saying, an African American man is threatening me. White fear can be an unholy tool, turning something good, like a healthy fear, of something that can be dangerous into something that can be weaponized. And this has deadly consequences. In the poem this morning, Nikki Giovanni asks, do I have the right to kill because I am frightened? In fact, she says, I don't think I'm allowed to kill something because I am frightened. Are you? Am I? This isn't a philosophical exploration. It isn't some abstract argument. This is real business in the real world. This is no one else's work but yours or mine. Our fear, founded or unfounded, the ways that we are subtly or not so subtly taught to fear or other people has life and death consequences. People who are not dangerous are killed because others are frightened or in a system of oppression. Think of names like these. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy who was killed within 2 seconds of a police car arriving near him while he was holding a replica pistol. Not dangerous. Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black man out for a jog. Botham Jean, a 26-year-old black accountant shot in his own apartment here in Dallas. Or Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old EMT shot in her own home when the police entered without warning, and so many more. I don't think I'm allowed to kill something because I am frightened. Or someone. See, some fear protects the things and people that we love, and some things are actually dangerous, and some fear destroys. And that's what I want to talk about today. The difference between a holy fear that creates and protects and gives voice to what's worthy of our love, and a kind of destructive or violent fear that we learn that can have deadly consequences in the world. Nikki Giovanni's poem is about her coming across a spider, one that wasn't dangerous, but one that she killed. She says, I killed a spider, not a murderous brown recluse, nor even a black widow. And if the truth were told, this was only a small sort of papery spider who should have run when I picked up the book. But she didn't. And she scared me, and I smashed her. I don't think I'm allowed to kill something because I am frightened. This week, we had a class earlier in the week where we gathered and reflected on this poem together as a group of congregants. And different words stood out to different people. Some noticed that this black activist, Nikki Giovanni, uses the words black and brown to describe the spiders. Some people noticed that the spider was a she throughout. Some noticed that it looked like there was blame being assigned to the spider. She should have run, but she didn't. For me, the word papery stood out. Because I imagined to myself how many times I have feared things that were papery. Moments in my life that I would dread that turned out to not be anywhere near as dangerous or as frightening or threatening as I thought they would be. How many things have we feared? Like a snake at the door. Turned out to be paper or shadows. You see, for me, fear has been a constant companion in my life. Whether the fear of trying to please others or something happening, I have often not acted out of a sense of what I deeply love, but running away from something. Fear has been a constant passenger. And my guess is that I am not alone. One of the things that stood out to me in reading that poem with the congregation and its members was that almost every person, including myself, our first assumption was that fear was a bad thing. It's something you want to get rid of. And yet fear can be such a precious gift. Fear can be part of evolution's gift to us, the universe's gift to us. Fear can be a part of God's plan and an act of grace as well. Perhaps the most common piece of advice in the Bible is the phrase, do not be afraid, or fear not, depending on what translation you're using. Depending on the translation, it either occurs 170 times or 360. Whatever the case, the point is this phrase, be not afraid. Don't be afraid is said over and over and over, written by people who were trying to give voice to the desires of God for humankind. My guess is the reason they wrote those words is twofold. One, because they were driven by fear in the same ways that probably you and I know I so often am. They had questions like, will my family be safe? Will we have enough to eat this year or this month or tonight? Will the people in charge of my city or my country make good choices that keep me safe, or will my life and livelihood be in danger because of their greed or incompetence? These worries are nothing new. But I think the phrase, be not afraid, is written into those scriptures so many times because there is also fundamental trust that at the heart of all creation is the force of life itself, that life is not against us, that God loves us, that we can trust foundational elements of being alive and making meaning, that we're held by something bigger than any one of us can imagine alone. Be not afraid in the scriptures does not mean that everything is going to turn out okay. Often it doesn't. It doesn't mean that everyone will be safe. We are hardly ever actually safe. Nowhere in those scriptures does it say, don't have fear because everything's going to be all right, and if you're afraid, you're wrong. It just says, be not afraid. Maybe it's hope for us. You see, in my experience, fear can also be a gift from God. It can be an act of grace, evolution's gift that keeps us safe and secure from things that really are dangerous. A life with no fear is not a safe life at all. And so we can say thank you to the fear that kept our ancestors safe. Thank you to the fear that told your grandmother's 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 grandmother 1,000 times back that she should jump out of the way of the saber-toothed tiger, and she was so generous that she gave us her anxiety and fear in our very genes. Thank you to that moment that kept her alive. Thank you to the fear that told someone that we love to run or get out of a bad situation before it was too late. Thank you to my honest fear of squandering a life that makes me try and make the most use of every day that I can. Thank you. And thank you for the fear that would cause my mother to kill a poisonous snake at the door. Because the protection of a child is a holy thing. But like any tool, how we make use of fear, how we understand it, how we relate to it, and how we respond to it can make all the difference. It can turn something from protection to destruction. Fear can be a good and dear protector. God can be speaking in that too. Some things are worthy of fear because they're dangerous. A deadly virus that deserves our attention. Or a baton beat against the back of a peaceful protester. A gun pointed at you or someone that you love held by someone who can legally end your life. Some things are worthy of fearing. How we choose to respond, how we sit with our fear, how we respond to that makes all the difference in the world. And this is not someone else's work to do. It's ours. There's not some other time to do it. This is it. And this is not an abstract question. How we as individuals and a society respond to the lessons of whom we have been taught to fear will have life and death consequences. There's a story I love in the Buddhist tradition that says, while the Buddha was sitting, waiting to be enlightened, he sat for 40 days under the Bodhi tree, and on the 39th night, The last day before his enlightenment, he was visited by the demon god Mara. Mara is the god of death or illusion. It's not unlike the Christian scriptures where Jesus is tempted by the devil in the desert before he begins his work. And in this passage in the story, the Buddha is sitting waiting to be enlightened, and the demon god Mara appears before him and offers him temptations and threats. The first is a temptation. He offers his daughters to the Buddha. The second is fear for his life. He makes pictures of angry demons running at him, which could devour him alive. The last temptation, the last fear, is the fear of being a fraud or failure. Mara says to the almost Buddha, "Who do you think you are? You can't do this. And even if you could, why do you think you're so special? Who do you think you are?" Playing on the fear of being a fraud or a charlatan or failing at such a dramatic act. It's said that in the stories, every time that Mara would send a temptation or a fear to the Buddha, he would raise his hand gently in the air and then touch the ground, and a flower would appear. After the Buddha attained enlightenment, as the story goes, this demon god of death and illusion, Mara, still couldn't stand it and would show up to the Buddha's sermons to heckle him from the audience. The Buddha's response was to say simply, "I see you, Mara. Come to tea." Heckling and screaming from the sidelines or trying to make the Buddha afraid, he would say, "I see you, Mara. Come and sit with me for tea." As hard as it might be for us to do, I think we can do that with our fears. Whether it's the fear of failure, the fear of not living up to expectations, the fear of losing someone you love if you are honest, the fear that we're taught of certain kinds of people and certain bodies. We can turn destructive or life-taking fear and turn it into protective, holy, constructive guidance and protection when we say, "I see you, fear." Let's sit for a moment. One of the ways that we can turn a fear that destroys into a fear that protects is to say, "I see you," to invite Mara to tea. Because in my experience, I have learned that one of the surest ways I get away from the things that plague me is not to run, to pause and reflect, to treat those fears, those anxieties, and those worries as teachers. Not always at the superficial lesson. It's not always right on the surface. When I notice my chest feeling tight, my jaw clenching, the fight or flight response, when I notice that I'm feeling a certain situation will be dangerous or a certain person will, we stop and say, "I see you, fear. What do you have to teach me?" Sometimes the lesson is that some things are worth fearing. Sometimes the lesson is that we have been taught a destructive and unhealthy response. Invite Mara to tea in your life. And turn that destruction into protection and creation. And pay attention to what you have been taught to fear and whom you have been taught to fear. Is it the holy kind that protects what is worthy of your love, or is it the destructive kind that, if ignored or acted upon, would allow some lives to be more easily taken than others? Because your family, your church, this one included, your society, your country, your president, are all speaking messages about what is worthy of love and what is worthy of fear. Pay attention to the messages that are being spoken. And reflect on whether it's calling you to move toward life and protection of what you love or toward isolation and destruction. And you can also teach A good and holy fear, because a good and holy fear, the one that protects something you love, gives voice to what's worthy of your love. A good and holy fear says that some things are worthy of protecting and guarding and lifting up. Sometimes that can teach you what is most worthy of your life's purpose and love, too. Sometimes it's a snake at the door. And sometimes it's a papery spider that would do us no harm. Sometimes it's a fear of our own inadequacy or how we would show up and meet the standards in the eyes of God or others. And sometimes it's a person that we've been taught to fear so long in subtle and not so subtle ways that their lives get taken more easily than others in a country or a city. You get to decide if you will invite that fear to tea. You get to decide if you will pay attention to the messages you're being taught about what's worthy of fear and what's worthy of love. You get to decide whether your subtle and not so subtle actions will teach others around you whether to isolate or reach out. You get to decide whether you will respond to something that can be a grace and a gift, a real, honest fear, in a way that creates and protects or destroys. Choose wisely. The consequences are very real. May it be so, and amen.